The difference between communism and socialism was that socialism was just communism that hadn't yet ripened, and the German government had been running work centers in industrial areas for decades, so communism was expected to be an easy next step. The new industrial worker that Marx wrote about was especially appealing to Germans who had jobs and were proud of their work, while winning over the agricultural peasants in Russia remained an uphill battle. And so the communist agitators explained that communism was scientific, and that approach pretty well appealed to everyone, even though it ended up being less about science and more about being anti-God. In Germany, the Nazis were busy rediscovering paganism while also embracing science. And the paganism went along with their roaring 20s as Germans reveled in party-going and devised fun costumes and conducted pagan parades in hopes of forgetting the misery they'd suffered in the Great War. The new scientific theory of genetics caught everyone's imagination, and that meant eugenics and race science that was coupled with the construction of new scientifically designed work camps intended to address the complaints being made by the communists about conditions victimizing the proletariat workers. In large part, Marx's apologists had been correct that the advancement of industrial technology created an entirely new class of people, as during the Great War, the railroads had allowed German soldiers to come home from the trenches on leave quickly and often, and the soldiers saw rich people in the cities making a financial killing on war profiteering, and Hitler vowed to reclaim all Germany's wealth that had been stolen by these Jews. Germany had built a few hundred miles of railroads by 1840 and built 10 times that much more by 1850. In 1840, for instance, Germany possessed only 282 miles of railway line, increased to 5,134 in 1850. The old Germany of peasants and princes was disappearing. Industries were being founded, machinery introduced, and during the 25 years preceding 1848, a new middle class came into being, business and professional men, manufacturers, office workers, and, with industrialization, an increasing proletariat. Queen Victoria, from her birth to the death of the Prince Consort, by Cecil Woodham Smith, New York, Alfred A. Knopf, 1972, page 295. When steamships replaced sailing ships, coal became the fuel of choice, and ships made of steel replaced ships made of wood, and only coal produced enough power for the new metal ships that burned 3 or 4 tons per hour at cruising speed and up to 10 tons at maximum speed. Wood did not produce enough heat for even an emergency substitute, and warships carried up to 10,000 tons of coal, so Britain's dependence on the coal miners increased. The coal miners wanted higher wages and better working conditions from their overlords, and some of the more lily-livered trade unions easily buckled under the British threat of force, but coal miners were a breed apart, and the strikes were the worst in 1926, and coal miners were the last to go back to work. The British thought Russian commies were behind the strikes, especially because Russian coal miners had been the backbone of the Russian Revolution. And without oil-burning furnaces to heat English homes, the Crown was dependent on coal miners to keep that coal coming. And Britain also needed coal to keep up their iron production for building the new ships. Britain maintained coaling stations in all the 7 seas for powering the Royal Navy around the world, and they needed the coal miners to supply those coaling stations, and when ships burning oil replaced coal after 1900, the miners were being cut back, fueling the Union strikes. Coal-fired battleships could be seen miles away with their thick black plumes of smoke, and ships burning oil were much less messy, and the American Navy had hired British boats to supply coal during the Spanish-American War in 1908, but the British coaling boats had failed to make deliveries on time, and the American Navy was stopped dead in the water, so America immediately built some coal delivery boats of their own. The Panama Canal opened in August of 1914, after the French had given it up as hopeless in 1904, having started it in 1881. And now American ships could cross from the Pacific to the Atlantic in only 11 hours, and America had paid $50 million to Panama and France for the right to that strip of land. When an experimental oil-burning engine on the U.S. steamship Cheyenne worked, American ships could be resupplied at sea with pipe cranes for ship-to-ship pumping, while transfer of coal had been a dirty and tiresome job possible only in calm harbors. America built tankers that carried oil to its first two battleships, the Oklahoma and the Nevada, in 1912. And America named its oilers after American rivers, and the first oiler was named the Kanawha and was launched from San Francisco Bay in 1914. Lieutenant Nimitz had been a submarine man and was sent to Germany to study diesel engines in the summer of 1913 at a company in Nuremberg, and the first oiler sent to sea had Lieutenant Nimitz on board as XO and chief engineer. And after the Great War, Nimitz would be promoted to chief of staff to the commander of the Atlantic submarine fleet. When America entered the Great War on the 6th of April in 1917, Nimitz's oiler was the first to refuel American ships at sea, and a month later, on the 18th of May in 1917, America began the draft, and 2 million American soldiers went overseas, financed by the first Liberty loan for $2 billion at 3.5%, and after the Great War, every European country owed America money. The British had given the world cotton mills and the spinning jenny, railroads and library science, and the first boat had gone up the Thames powered by steam in 1812, named the Comet, and the following year in 1813, Westminster Bridge was lit by gas lamps. English Luddites rioted over these new technologies from 1811 to 1815, angry that science was putting people out of work, and the Luddite agitators complained until the great Chartist uprising that was just one of many in the year of revolutions in 1848. The Irish had been a thorn in Britain's side and were always at the heart of workers' strikes. And Ireland was half the size of Georgia, and many Irish migrated to America because of the Great Potato Famine of 1845. Those who did not leave Ireland in the Potato Famine would join in the year of revolutions in 1848, and the Crown would respond to these revolutionaries by repealing the Corn Laws, which was an easy call because enough money had been coming into the Queen's coffers after the success of the First Opium War, along with the British income tax begun in 1842. The first Factory Act in 1833 had made it unlawful for children under the age of 9 to work in factories, and for children under 13 to work more than 8 hours a day, while everyone else had to limit themselves to 12-hour days. The British workers wrote a People's Charter in 1838 asking for the right to vote, and that vote would give them a representative in Parliament, and a bill allowing the Chartists to vote only passed because Parliament included a clause giving themselves a salary for sitting in Parliament. The Crown had let more people vote in 1832 because the growth of industry created a class of merchants and managers, so English money was no longer only in the hands of the nobility. But even with the new voting laws of 1832, only 5% of the population qualified to cast a ballot. To add insult to injury, The English worker had been finding out that the industrial rich cared less for the common people than had the nobility, and the Irish marched on the Parliament during the year of revolutions in 1848 to present a petition signed by 1 million people, but the Crown hired 200,000 special constables to infiltrate the crowd and shut them down. When the march failed, the Irish went back home, while the British Army marched off to the Crimea, after which they returned to China for Opium War II, and the Indians in India had mutinied in 1857, and the Italians threw the Austrians out of the Trieste port with the help of the French in 1859, and cotton from the American South was cut off in 1861. British mills needed to get cotton from Egypt and India that could be shipped through the Suez Canal, and the Irish who practiced fighting in the American War between the states came back from North America to help free Ireland in 1867. But the British arrested enough of these Irish to stop them, and British officials were sent into Ireland in 1870 to tax the locals and build schools, but they weren't allowed to be Roman Catholic schools. To make the British people feel better about their government, the Trades Union Act of 1871 somewhat protected labor unions, but was joined to a law forbidding them to picket, and the Ballot Act of 1872 allowed the people to vote in secret rather than under the nose of their bosses. As Russia marched into Constantinople in 1871, England passed a law that military commissions could continue to be bought even though the House of Lords voted to end that unfortunate practice, and the Irish demanded Home Rule in 1881 because they could no longer afford to pay rent to Britain, so the Irish were put in jail. But to make Ireland feel better, more people were allowed to vote in 1884. Gladstone's Home Rule for Ireland Bill, passed in 1886, setting up a parliament in Ireland and allowing them to rule themselves, provided they pay their share of imperial expenses and defer to the Crown in all foreign matters, including conscription into the British military. And the bill was defeated after it was passed, so Victoria dissolved her parliament, and the following year the Crown sent some money to improve Ireland if the Irish agreed not to assemble in public and to obey the police crackdown and waive their right to jury trials. A Home Rule Bill was passed again in 1891, but was thrown out by the House of Lords, and the Factory and Workshops Bill that passed in 1895 made some minor workplace improvements, and in 1901 the House of Lords made the workers' unions liable for any damages caused by strikes. 5 years later, that was repealed, and the following year, workmen's compensation was born in England. But because so many workmen's comp claims were being filed by exhausted, injury-prone miners, work in the coal mines was limited in 1908 to 8 hours per day. The following year, the unions were forbidden to use union funds for political purposes, and in 1911, the employers had to pay for workmen's comp themselves instead of the Crown, so the Great Railway Strike was on and would continue until the Great War broke out and all railroads came directly under control of the military. The Parliament Law of 1911 said that if Parliament passed a law 3 times, the House of Lords could no longer overrule it, and the Trade Union Act of 1913 allowed unions to spend their money on politics, and the Home Rule Bill finally passed in 1914, giving Ireland a parliament of their own just in time to be conscripted into the Great War, where 400,000 Irish and British soldiers would die advancing 9 miles in the First Battle of the Somme. In America, 2 million pounds of explosive artillery shells destined for France were packed into several dozen railway cars that exploded in New York Harbor in July of 1916, blowing out most of the windows in Jersey City, and the blast was felt as far away as Philadelphia and took 3 hours to fire off. Samuel Gompers helped with the investigation after the munitions finally went silent, and German-American longshoremen were suspected of helping the Germans help the Irish fight the British by setting off the blast. Gompers had been born in Britain, where he'd seen many ordnance shipments accidentally blown up on British docks, those shipments being sent to Britain from America. And 62 years later, JFK would tread on thin ice because he was both Irish and Catholic, and he had also married a Frenchwoman. The Great War killed 13 million people, and the British lost more officers than enlisted, because the officers were trained to personally lead the charge into battle, and for the first time during Hitler's war, more civilians would die than soldiers as the result of aerial bombing and improved long-range shelling. The trench warfare of the Great War offered untold despair as armies faced each other across no man's land for years, hoping that starvation and suffering would grind down the other side. And the growth of technology also made the Great War what it was, not just in terms of firepower, but because the advanced ships and railroads spread the flu around the world in its wake, and so the fighting had stopped not so much from any battlefield maneuvers, but because the flu knocked everyone out of action. When the guns went silent, the British passed the Education Act requiring the English to go to school until age 14, instead of the previous 13 years of age with compulsory part-time school until age 18, and at the same time they passed the Parliamentary Reform Act of 1918, doubling the number of people in Britain allowed to vote, so now 16 million common British were allowed to cast a ballot, after 1 million of them had perished in the Great War. While the British were administering Arabia and Turkey and Iraq after the Great War, back home the coal miners went out on strike again, so the Crown threatened to nationalize the mines, and that stopped the strikes. And in return for going back to work, the railroad workers were finally given a minimum wage, but the Irish continued fighting in the streets in spite of the new Government of Ireland Act of 1920, and despite being given Dominion status for the Irish Free State in 1921. The miners struck again for higher wages, and France marched into Germany to demand more money in 1923, knowing that the Crown was talking to the Germans about taking over reparations payments under the guise of ending the German inflation. And France didn't mind the German inflation because the exchange rates highly favored France. When Britain tried to clamp down on France benefiting from the deal, the French became closer friends with Germany in their mutual trade war against the Crown. So in 1924, the British newspapers used yellow journalism to stir up fear of Jew communists infiltrating the French and German banks, and the Labour Party in England was defeated by popular vote. The Germans had been put on trial as part of the Versailles Treaty, but the list went from 900 people to only 45, and while a few were given short jail sentences, none were executed. Some German business people were given 3 years in jail, but that was a reward because everybody else was starving while the prisoners ate well under American guard, and there was just enough time to bury the dead, clear away the barbed wire, clean up the rubble, and fill in the trenches before the war criminals were let out of jail and given their old jobs back, most with salary increases. The Treaty of Versailles wasn't so horrible, except that Germany was supposed to give up all its large military hardware and cut the army down to 100,000 men, And that would not be easy because the German soldiers from the trenches had not been defeated on the battlefield, but were allowed to march home with their weapons, because the war had ended diplomatically rather than in any military victory. Soldiers had fallen deeply in love with their fatherland after fighting so hard for Germany in their trenches for 4 years, and they saw themselves as different from the stupid English and the insane French, and mostly Germans thought of themselves as quite unlike the stubborn Russians, who had nonetheless abandoned the battlefield before the war was over. People were fed up with the old order, and the writing of the Jewish Marx had been soaring in popularity because it was so interesting and easy to read, and the idea of, quote, the common man, close quote, was shared by both Marx and Hitler was a common person, more like the regular German citizen, while the idea of the common man having anything to do with government was the most revolutionary idea of all. Initially, the common man notion was despised by both the bankers and the German nobility, but upon reflection they decided that they could use Hitler's popularity towards their own ends, to both stamp out communism and to get the German economy moving again, and in that vein, Hitler was definitely a common man. The aristocracy believed that Hitler could be told what to do since he was such a good soldier during the Great War and knew how to take orders. And Hitler didn't blame rich people for the war because he liked them, and he wanted them to like him too. The communists wanted to completely put an end to the nobility, and the revised words of Marx were being widely read, and the new Marxism was being heralded by the communists in the cities, while German peasants just stuck to the old German stories and myths, and Hitler was definitely their man. After the Great War, the nobility had been forced to tighten their belts to pay taxes to the blossoming Weimar government, and the nobility began cutting wages paid to their help, and that meant the working class were doing far more for less and were eagerly voting communist. People in Germany were thoroughly disgusted with those who had brought on the Great War, and were on fire for a communist revolution to get rid of the nobility that had supported the Kaiser in the Great War, and Hitler seemed like a good choice in order to stop the communists. A wagon full of dynamite had hit Wall Street on the 20th of September in 1920 that killed 40 people and wounded hundreds, and 24 bombs were sent through the mail to bankers and business leaders, actions widely understood to have been done by communists, and the socialist Weimar government, charging such high taxes on the nobility, left little to pay wages for workers and servants who were listening to the pie-in-the-sky promises made by communists they did not know enough to disbelieve. Many Nazis thought the unemployed simply did not want to work, and the factories had lost so many workers killed in the Great War that there should have been jobs available, but these had been mostly skilled positions that were already filled, and so the unskilled went jobless. Unemployment grew as factories were driven out of business from the high taxes required of socialism, and going out of business meant that more Germans became unemployed. In 1926, Hitler had wanted to give back the money and property confiscated from the nobility after the Great War because it would be against communism, while the socialist Strasser wanted to keep it. But Hitler knew he needed to unite Germany, and that meant including the nobility, especially the officer class of the military. Hitler said the Nazis were for, quote, private property and justice, close quote. And the justice part meant getting Germany's wealth back from the Jews who had sacrificed Germany in the Great War, both from war profiteering on the home front and from their connivance in writing the Treaty of Versailles. A man in America named Leibold had come up with the phrase international Jew. to distinguish them from all the other Jews, but it backfired as all Jews were seen to be involved in an international conspiracy. Henry Ford told Leibold to dig up dirt on international Jews, and Leibold sent a man to the public library, and the man returned to say, quote, "What a wonderful race they were, and how little he'd known of their history, and what a magnificent history it was," close quote. Ford, Expansion and Challenge, 1915 to 1933, by Alan Nevins and Frank Ernest Hill, New York's Charles Scribner's Sons, 1957, page 314. It wasn't so much that Jews were seen as foreign, since they'd been around for as long as anyone could remember. But in Germany in particular, the zeitgeist of religion was exquisitely jarring after the Great War, when the old attitude of the grace of God had been replaced by a sense of bewilderment and unfairness. Unfortunately for Jews, the business of the Great War had been exceptionally lucrative, as money was borrowed and lavishly spent on both guns and butter, and the longer the war continued, the more money had been made on the endeavor. Jews were considered distasteful in America and were excluded from many establishments, and America cut back on immigration in the 1920s because of communism, while in Germany, Jews were mostly seen as commies. The new Weimar government wanted their interests protected, and that meant stamping out communism. So the new German army's job after the Great War was to find communists and root them out. When not fighting the communists, the soldiers returned from the trenches would visit the homes of the noble officers in the middle of the night who had betrayed their cause in the Great War, and the stabbed-in-the-back soldiers would hunt them down and rip off their insignia before executing them for treason against the fatherland, while no ordinary German thought of it as murder. With the Treaty of Versailles, Germany had to give the army a new name, so they called it the Reichswehr, that meant national defense. And it wasn't just Nazis who were marching up and down the streets singing, but the communists were also on parade. The Nazis saw themselves as the bridge between capitalism and socialism, and as the two groups met on street corners or in open fields outside town, serious fights broke out, and the police themselves would take sides, and the Nazis had more support from the regular German citizens because the communists were friends with the same Russians that Germany had just faced in the trenches of the Great War. Unemployment was blamed for all the street fighting, because the combatants were excused as having nothing better to do. And while the theory was that those who wanted to work could find employment even though the sort of work available might not be their first choice, that would be proven when a good percentage of the communist Jews in Germany turned out to be superior workers when given the proper incentive. The idea of the noble proletariat who couldn't find any work turned out to be a myth invented by artists and their ilk, because the truth was that people unwilling to do the kind of work available had gotten used to having extra money during the Great War and were not willing to go back to the old economy that required some effort and some saving to buy necessities. While the German army was limited to 100,000 men by the Treaty of Versailles, the Germans were allowed to have a police force, and these groups were allowed to expand as needed, so Hitler and other returning soldiers signed up in brigades called the Freikorps, or Free Men, but they might as well have been called the German Hells Angels, and Professor Waite of Williams College called the Freikorps the Freebooters. The Weimar government was allowed to have their own army that they called the Stormtroopers, and this SA started with only 2,000 members called brown shirts because they wore brown army shirts since there were so many of these left over from the war. But the Stormtroopers might just have as well have been called the Rolling Thunder, and were first called the Sports Department because the army was not supposed to have that many soldiers. The Freikorps were volunteers who came from the tens of thousands delisted after the armistice, and while they were not an official law enforcement body, they were paid wages and benefits. These German Hells Angels were men who'd grown up in Wandervogel or Migratory Birds, where they spent weeks building bonfires and listening for messages from the woods. Conditions varied in each corps, but a hypothetical average volunteer could expect to receive a daily base pay of from 30 to 50 marks. He was guaranteed 200 grams of meat and 75 grams of butter a day. Service in the Freikorps counted towards workers' and farmers' pensions. His family received the regular family allotment. At the end of his period of enlistment, the volunteer drew the pay allotted to all demobilized soldiers. He was, of course, completely clothed by the government. Officers received extra bonuses, which varied with the area in which they served. The volunteers were satisfied with the arrangements. One of them writes, Noski added 5 marks brackets to the regular pay close brackets, and the Bavarian government another 5. Then too we got plenty of beer and cigarettes and a quarter of a liter of wine a day. We had a good time. The Nazi Revolution, Germany's Guilt or Germany's Fate, edited by John L. Snell Boston, Problems in European Civilization, D.C. Heath and Company, 1959, page 64. They were not active army, but the army helped by giving them equipment, and the army would bring them along to shoot at communists. And the name Freikorps, more precisely in German, meant the liberators, and suggested they were allowed to operate outside the law. The English word Freikorps does not describe the fervor Germans felt for these groups as much more than mere protectors, but along with their usefulness, the name included the sure sense of romance that came with being outlaws. The Russian communists had plenty of French sympathizers, so the running street battles by the Nazis were just a continuation of the Great War. And the German Hells Angels and the Red Communists fought it out in the streets, and thousands of Reds died. And the battle was not so much about left versus right as it was about globalists versus patriots. Both sides had been trained on the battlefield and had kept their weapons they had been allowed to carry home from the Great War, and the army was supplying them with ammo, making it available not only for politics but also for profit. It was lawless and frightening, and in January of 1919, the Red Communists tried to take over Berlin, and the German Hells Angels marched in and dispatched them. And while the German Hells Angels held power in Berlin until March, the labor unions went on strike, and the regular government came back. The next week, a vote was held, and 30 out of 35 people voted, with women allowed to vote for the first time. And the Reds received only a very small number of the votes, so to quell the rioting, the government gave everyone an 8-hour working day, the right to join trade unions, and some work benefits, and they released political prisoners from jail and abolished press censorship. But they had to move the government to Weimar, because it was no longer safe in Berlin. In April, on Palm Sunday, the Reds marched on Dachau, while the government put 8,000 men against them, and 60 German Hells Angels died in this fight because both sides had learned on the battlefield not to take prisoners, and hundreds of Reds were killed in retaliation, and people began to wish that the communists had been more successful. Hitler was arrested for inciting a riot, and he went kicking and screaming to jail, comparing his arrest to that of Jesus Christ. And Hitler spent 5 weeks in jail meditating on the Jewish conspiracy of it all. The communists overthrew the government in Bavaria, and the army and the German Hells Angels marched in to save them, and they wore their talisman swastika armbands while the townsfolk cheered them on. And many military officers were there in Bavaria because they had fled to escape the night execution squads. A group of German officers were meeting at the Four Seasons Hotel every week, and one of them was Hitler's old commander, who was a good friend of General Ludendorff. And the commander suggested that Hitler, the trusted motorcycle messenger, was a good candidate for training as a civilian spy for the army. It was illegal for any member of the army to be involved in politics, and these spies were sent for secret training at the University of Munich. And a description of Munich was that the city was like a second Paris, quote, southern atmosphere, blue skies, mountains, a touch of Italy, close quote. Unknown, page 322. Hitler's recruitment as spy was part of his probation from getting arrested, and one professor at the Munich spy school thought Hitler had a gift for speaking and helped him to improve his oratory skills. The trenches of the Great War had been a perfect place for interminable political discussions, and Hitler had practiced winning people over with words, and Hitler's fellow students at the spy school spent most of their time discussing the fact that the Great War had not been Germany's fault. Hitler was given a private room because he was bothering the other students, and after class, Hitler would go out for a beer where he found pamphlets the German Hells Angels had been leaving in all the local taverns. After his training to be a Reichsführer army spy, Hitler went out to labor union meetings because the Weimar government wanted to help the workers' unions to keep the communists away. And German business had no room for radical communist labor unions, and Hitler's new boss Ludendorff was, quote, an old and trusted friend of German big business, close quote. The Crime and Punishment of I.G. Farben by Joseph Borkin, New York, The Free Press, a Macmillan Company, 1978, page 21. One of the political groups Hitler visited in those 90 days was called the German Workers' Party, or the Deutschlander Arbeiterpartie, the DAP. And Hitler was paid 20 gold marks per week to keep an eye out for communist agitators sent by the British or the French, who were deporting their own labor troublemakers, and the army knew for certain that the Russians were involved due to the mystery of how Lenin got back into Russia on that sealed train, and the army also suspected that these foreign agitators were sent in hopes Germany would break the armistice now that the Americans were available to help them finish off Germany for good. The German Workers' Party wanted the nobility to get closer to the working classes, which was considered the middle class, in order to outnumber the lower class communists. And that was an inspiring idea to Ludendorff and his friends in the nobility. If the working class, the socialists, could get along with the nobility, the nationalists, there would be no reason to fear the uprising of the great unwashed peasant revolutionary communists, the leaders of whom just happened to be Jewish, and their communist doctrine that just happened to have been written by the German Jewish Marx. Hitler reported to the army that the German Workers' Party should be supported, and he personally joined up with the DAP on the 16th of September in 1919. And Hitler found a small office that had been a tap room for storing beer kegs, and he put in an electric light and a telephone. Only 7 members belonged to the German Workers' Party at the time, but it soon became 13 and then 34. And they printed up membership cards, starting with number 501, to make it seem that there were more members, and Hitler was number 555. They printed some leaflets and announced a meeting on the 16th of October in 1919 where 70 people showed up, and Hitler gave his first speech, but it didn't make the newspapers. And they had another meeting on the 13th of November where some people in the audience tried to shout him down, but Hitler's friends beat them up. While some members thought that meeting every 2 weeks was too much, Hitler asked for a meeting every week and won, so they began meeting every week. One reason Hitler was so popular was because the name Hitler in German meant hot guy, and Hitler also liked to be called Wolf, saying it was the primitive name of Adolf. Hitler had been born on the 20th of April in 1889, and Hitler was born when his mother was on her third husband just after the heir to the Austrian throne, Rudolf, had committed suicide. Hitler's grandmother was Maria Anna Schicklgruber, and she'd worked as a maid for the Frankenbergers in Graz, Austria in 1837, although their name might have been Frankenreither. And the Frankenbergers were Jewish, and their son had a child with Hitler's grandmother, the maid Maria, when he was 19 years old. Hitler's grandmother had been named after the revered Maria Theresa, and 1/3 of all children born in Austria at the time were illegitimate, and when her son Alois was born, the senior Frankenberger paid child support to her for 14 years. Alois Schicklgruber changed his last name to Hitler in 1876 and married his third wife Clara in 1885, who was 23 years his junior, and her first child would be born 5 months later. The new wife Clara gave Alois Hitler 6 children, and Adolf was the 4th born, while the first 3 children died before their 2nd birthday, and the 5th child died right before his 6th birthday, and the last child, Paula, would survive. Alois had married a woman named Franziska and already had 2 children, Alois and Angela, the boy born illegitimate, and Angela had 2 children, and Angela called Gelly, and the other boy. And Adolf's father bought a farm, but it was a failure, and he would beat both the kids and the animals. Adolf Hitler didn't have girlfriends in high school, but told fairy stories about German warriors in the Crusades, and he did not fight with his father about wanting to be an artist, but about his bad grades. And Adolf Hitler quit school at age 16 to spend 2 years painting pictures of buildings, but he would rarely put people in his paintings except as small dark stick figures. Before the Great War, there was little homelessness in Germany because the government provided workmen's halls where men could either pay for their shelter or trade their rent for work, and they had shower facilities with disinfection stalls and a live-in staff, including a barber, a tailor, a shoemaker, cooks in the kitchen, and a free medical dispensary. Anything needed for work, such as tools, were also free, and the German government was also sending monthly checks to the unemployed Germans living under French rule in Alsace-Lorraine. The Germans loved the state for what it provided to them, and Hitler was collecting an orphan's pension after his father died in 1903 and his mother died in 1907. And when Hitler became homeless for 90 days, he slept at the amusement park or in bars and only went to the workers' barracks once because he was not a worker. Sometimes Hitler went to a shelter run by a generous Jewish man, and sometimes he ate soup at the church, and Hitler would shovel snow for a few cents or carry luggage at the train station, and he made postcards and then painted small watercolors and would sell them on the street. Some Jewish art dealers would buy them, and once Hitler sold these Jews his coat, and he tried panhandling but failed at being a beggar, and he got into a fistfight with some workers over politics, and then Hitler tried to get into art school but was rejected. His aunt sent him a little money in December, and then she died and left him a little more. And he was still receiving his orphan's pension, so he told the court to give his share to his sister. And Hitler continued cooking his own food and wearing ragged clothes and keeping his hair long, and he grew a beard. Hitler spent a lot of time in his room reading books, but not the sort of thing taught in schools. Instead, he read popular novels and war history books and old German folk stories from before the Middle Ages, when knights in shining armor with their skill at slaying dragons were sung about in the lost German rhyming book of chivalry. Everyone in Vienna had to register their address with the police every time they moved. And when Hitler went to Munich in May of 1913, he told the police that he was a writer, but mostly he claimed to be an artist. Hitler knocked on doors and visited beer halls to sell his art, and when Hitler received his Austrian draft summons, he was rejected by the draft board as not strong enough to carry a gun, so Hitler applied a second time and was allowed to go to the Great War as a motorcycle messenger. Hitler loved being a soldier, and it made him feel useful and worthy, and the bike was a hoot. Germany used a shaft drive instead of chains, and the cylinders stuck out the side for better air cooling and for crash protection. And getting around on the motorcycle during the Great War was more fun than a soldier in the trenches ought to have. When Hitler spoke to the members of the German Workers' Party, it was lively and personal and emotional, and people loved listening to him. And he told the Germans that they were great, and that Germany was great, and that they were going to become even greater. And he spoke with the fervor and respect he had learned living in the trenches with his brothers in arms for 4 long years. People would come to hear Hitler speak more for the entertainment than for the substance, and it was cheaper to go listen to Hitler's speeches than to go to the theater or the opera, and they didn't have to dress up, and it was way and beyond more fun than going to church. Hitler would shout and holler and beg and plead and scream and spit and swoon, and people loved hearing him, and at night by torchlight it was truly magical. While few took him seriously and came for the fun of it, they also came for the beer. Hitler had his speeches printed in large type so he wouldn't have to wear his glasses in public, and it wasn't just the meetings and the speeches that made the Nazis so popular, but that they got involved in the personal lives of the members, helping them to find jobs and housing or settling personal disputes. The party would go for cookouts and barbecues and potlucks, and after the meetings they'd go out for coffee and cake. And the word nationalist was added to the Workers' Party on the 8th of August in 1920, giving them the nickname Nazi. The meetings turned into groups that were called circles, and groups were formed in other countries with an overall steering committee set up at party headquarters, and the meetings didn't need visitor passes. The meetings didn't need visitor passer. This is hard. The meetings didn't need visitor passes because the membership knew right away who the newcomers were. People had been pouring into the cities to find work after the Great War, many still wearing their uniforms, and they would become homeless on the streets of Berlin and would show up at the Nazis' meetings where they were welcomed. People who didn't fit in anywhere else found belonging with the party, and the chairman would show up at the meeting hall early to make sure the chairs and the speaker podium were set up, and their guidelines suggested that at least a third of those present should be old-timers, so that members with some time in the program could prompt the responses and lead the applause. The bylaws stated that the membership had to be a mixture of rich and poor, of union worker and private labor, of educated and unskilled, unlike the communists, who were mostly intellectuals. And the party put a firm 30% limit on academic types. Women especially liked that Hitler was single and available, and his speeches emphasized the party program, and Hitler would read aloud from their written platform promises, and would finish each meeting with a call to unity and a unanimous solemn oath. To regular Germans, the most appealing thing about Hitler was that he was not an officer, one of those who had attended officer school, and neither was he one of the educated nobility, but Hitler was a commoner who read popular German history and Wild West novels by Karl May. In his little rented room, Hitler had many maps of Europe and biographies of military leaders and an extensive collection of heroic chivalric myths, and he had an encyclopedia with plenty of pictures and many books about the Great War, and Hitler also had a dog named Wolf. When he wasn't trying to write poetry in his room, Hitler was sitting in coffee houses or taverns where people were allowed to bring their own meals to eat along with their coffee or beer. And for the Nazis there was no more first class and coach, but all were considered brothers in the same boat. The year of revolutions, in 1848, had put fear into every noble aristocratic heart, and while Hitler hobnobbed with as many aristocrats as would align themselves with his cause, he insisted that he was a worker among workers, and to prove it, Hitler would eat his lunch sitting in the car next to his new chauffeur. Hitler used his speeches at the meetings to raise funds for the party, and people were asked to give $1 each to hear him speak. And when Hitler's speeches turned the meetings into rolling fistfights, they would march to the Rat House to continue the party there. While they collected dues from the members and took up collections at the meetings, the Nazis were careful not to keep financial records, so each group was self-supporting through their own contributions. The German Hells Angels would put on their uniforms and make the rounds of restaurants and coffee shops to pass the hat. And the local restaurants would save a table in the back for friends of Hitler, and people started calling him the King of Munich. Small business owners donated all they had, and local stores gave party members discounts, and little old ladies gave money hidden in their cookie jars. People donated paintings and clothes and jewelry and supplies, and made personal loans to the groups interest-free. And when the party couldn't afford to hire office workers, people would donate their time and labor. The groups remained poor in these first years, and the early days had been their best times before they found success. Hitler made friends with men who belonged to weekend militia groups like the Arbeitsgemeinschaft der Kampfverband, or the Weekend Warriors, and Hitler attracted people who enjoyed picking fights, and anyone who took a beating from the German Hells Angels or the stormtroopers became the most eager to sign up as new members. From neighborhood groups, the Nazis formed local inner groups called group circles, and the circles answered to block wardens, and the warden districts reported back to party headquarters, and they became more successful when they started choosing chairmen more carefully. Christopher Isherwood said that Hitler would speak in smoky rooms full of people drinking beer, and that they would hoot and holler and heckle him, but he would keep speaking until they started to listen, and once he had their attention, they went silent and would surrender themselves to his passionate dreams of a Germany reborn. Hitler would talk on until sweat ran down his face, and once he lost 20 pounds during one speech. And Isherwood said the German Hells Angels helped Hitler by protecting him physically and escorting him around town, and that the brawling gave them the feeling that they had not lost the war from being incapable of fighting. On the 14th of September in 1920, at the Lowenbrau Keller, or the Lion's Beer Cellar, the Bavarian League was meeting, and Hitler showed up with his friends, and they drank some beer and stashed their beer mugs under the tables for ammunition. And Hitler gave a long speech, and a fight broke out, and the German Hells Angels trashed the place, fighting the Social Democrats with beer mugs and table legs. People were thrown down the stairs, and by the time the police showed up, the fighting was over, so the police told everyone to go home. And after the Lowenbrau fight, the Bavarian government gave Hitler a permit to carry a pistol, and he wore it on his hip in a holster with a cartridge belt. The town of Coburg invited Hitler to visit and make a speech in October of 1922. So the German Hells Angels boarded a train with 800 members and a marching band. And while the city officials asked them not to march through town, they did it anyway. The citizens had been told not to pick any fights with the visitors, and the march was peaceful. So Hitler turned them around to do it a second time. And this time they marched through town with only the drums rolling, and the citizens of Coburg gave them the fight they'd come for, a rolling brawl that went on all day long and well into the night. As a result, Coburg became the strongest of all Hitler's groups, and between February and November of 1923, the Nazis gained 35,000 new members, and their treasury boomed, and the Nazi newspaper became a daily, and groups sending donations from other countries proved to Hitler that his message was welcome around the world. The Weimar government had asked Hitler to cut back on the number of meetings in 1922, and told the loitering Nazis to stay off the sidewalks. But Hitler had answered them with his new favorite slogan, "Over my dead body." The authorities tried to ban the party from having public rallies, not on ideological grounds, but because they knew the Nazis were too poor to pay rent for any of the available public facilities. And on the 27th of January in 1923, the Nazis held 12 different rallies, and they called it their first party day. Hitler would race from meeting to meeting, even though the chief of police told him that the rallies were banned. And the next day, on the 28th of January, the German Hells Angels went to a public stadium and marched around in the snow with plenty of banners and flags flying, and the marching was pretty impressive, because most of them had been trained in the military for the Great War. By the spring of 1923, the German Hells Angels had quite a following, and 1,300 of them gathered on May Day to fight communists, but no communists came, and instead they were surrounded by police and told to go home and stay home. People thought that Hitler was finished, but he went off to the vacation town of Berchtesgaden to work on his speeches, and Hitler found a whip made of rhinoceros hide that he would crack as he practiced speaking, and when he came back in public at the end of the summer. Hitler had shined his shoes and wore better clothes and had gotten a new haircut. Part of Hitler's upgrade came from his American friend named Putzi Hanfstaengl, who was working for the American Hearst newspapers and had been in President Wilson's class at Princeton and then graduated from Harvard. Putzi introduced Hitler to his many rich friends and impressed Hitler with his piano playing, and Putzi enjoyed meeting Hitler's lower-class friends, having had little previous contact with that kind of people, and Putsy would play the piano for them. Putsy had met Franklin Delano Roosevelt and had played the piano at the White House for FDR. And Putsy invited Hitler to dinner and showed him a bathroom faucet for the first time with variable hot and cold water. And Putsy hosted Hitler at the Humpfstengel House often. Putsy took Harvard's football songs and wrote Nazi lyrics for them and would play the piano while Hitler pretended to be the orchestra conductor. And while Putsy played the piano, Hitler practiced the hand gestures that would make him famous. Hitler went with Putsy to Berlin, and they spent many hours watching women boxers. And they stopped at Bayreuth, where the scenery from the last Wagnerian opera was still set up from before the Great War, waiting for the stagehands to return. Wagner's own production notes were still stuck up on the walls backstage, and Hitler called Wagner Baron Richard von Wagner, and Putsy told Hitler that his great-grandfather had designed the original set. By the end of 1923, the hecklers in the crowds had faded away and the protesters had stopped answering back. And while people would still complain to the police about the overflowing meetings, so many police were members themselves that it didn't do much good, and the police would just tell the complainants that the party was not a police problem and to please move along. The economy had improved in Germany in 1923, so on the 30th of October, Hitler decided the time was ripe to take over Germany, and the plan to march on Berlin was scheduled in 2 weeks on Armistice Day with the code word Sunrise. The plan was to seize the train stations, take over the telephone and telegraph offices, occupy the local government buildings, and take control of police headquarters. The plan should have worked, because the German Hells Angels were already friends with most of the army, and they outnumbered the police, those police officers who had not yet become members. And Hitler knew he could succeed in replacing all the government leaders, while his newspaper carried a picture of Count York on the front page, and the seizure of Berlin would commence with the beer hall putsch in Munich. Hitler had been invited by the local officials to a town meeting in Munich on the 8th of November at the Bürgerbraukeller, which in German meant where the people's brew is stored. And Hitler accepted the invitation, even though he knew they only wanted to restore the Bavarian monarchy and weren't interested in the rest of Germany. Austrians thought the Bavarians were backward peasants, and there were 2 Russian Jews in the Munich government, and the Bavarians assumed they were communists. The future Pope Pacelli was in town that day, and Hitler had a toothache, but he went to the meeting anyway, and the beer hall could seat 3,000 at sturdy wooden tables, and the place was packed. Hitler showed up in a red Mercedes, and the police escorted him inside. And it was so crowded that Putsy couldn't even get in, but had to bribe his way through with American cigarettes, getting in at the very last minute, and so he was standing safely by the exit. Putsy bought 3 beers that cost 1,000,000 marks apiece, and Hitler was carrying his rhino hide whip, and the crowd had been drinking enough to drown out the speakers. The first speech was given by the leader of the Bavarian government, and the German Hells Angels had arranged beforehand for everyone to get free beer. Hitler set aside the beer he'd been nursing, pulled out his Browning pistol, and, as the stormtroopers shouted, another group set up a machine gun position to rake the audience. Tables overturned in the uproar. A cabinet member scrambled for cover under his table. Some made for the exits in consternation, but were warned back and, if they resisted, were beaten or kicked. The Hitler phalanx was blocked, and and, amidst the uproar, he climbed onto a chair, waving his pistol. "Quiet," he shouted, and when the tumult continued, he fired a round into the ceiling. In the shocked silence, Hitler said, "The national revolution has broken out. The hall is surrounded." No one was to leave the hall. Sweat poured down his pale face. He looked insane or drunk to some, but a few were struck by the ridiculous sight of a pistol-brandishing revolutionary in such a badly cut morning suit. Adolf Hitler, Volume 1, by John Toland, New York, Doubleday and Company, 1976, page 163 and 4. The government leaders were taken into a side room where Hitler apologized to them and promised them a promotion if they would cooperate. And then he went back into the main hall where people were laughing and calling it a Mexican revolution, probably because Hitler had fired an American Browning pistol into the ceiling. Hermann Goering put another bullet into the ceiling, but the crowd kept laughing, so Goering ordered them to be quiet and just drink their beer. And then Hitler got on stage and started speaking, and everyone started listening, and then they began to applaud. Ludendorff showed up and shook Hitler's hand, and Röhm and the Rolling Thunder stormtroopers came marching up Ludwig Street with people lined up all along the way cheering and waving Nazi flags, and Röhm marched to army headquarters and went inside and unpacked some machine guns and rolled out some barbed wire, skills learned on the battlefield during the Great War. But the man working the telephone switchboard betrayed them and ruined the entire plan. Meanwhile, at the beer hall, things seemed to be under control after Goering announced that the hostages would be shot if the police interfered. And then some German Hells Angels started fighting among themselves, and Hitler had to go settle the argument, leaving Ludendorff in charge, and Ludendorff allowed the hostages to go free on their sworn sacred oath to cooperate because Ludendorff thought that German officers could be held to their word since they were noble gentlemen like himself. Some of the Nazis picked a handful of foreign Jewish-sounding names out of the phone book and went to their homes and dragged them away. And Hitler's friend Röhm was arrested, and then it started to snow. The next day, the Nazi flag was flying at City Hall and above some other government buildings, and countless private homes were also flying the swastika flag. And the mainstream newspaper gave the affair a nice review in the morning, while Hitler and 2,000 German Hells Angels carrying guns and grenades marched into the heart of town to break Röhm out of jail. The Nazis marched 16 abreast, and they broke into spontaneous song, and Ludendorff was in the front row and took a wrong turn, and they came right up against the state police, and the chief of police started sword fighting with somebody's bayonet, and a loose shot got off, and a policeman fell over dead, and then all hell broke loose. A Russian soldier who had fled the Red Revolution was killed shielding Hitler from several bullets, pulling him to the ground and dislocating his shoulder, and 4 policemen were shot and 14 German Hells Angels were killed, and the policeman had been shot for being on Hitler's side. Goering was hit in the groin but escaped arrest because a Jewish lady helped him to get to a private doctor, and as the march dispersed, the crowd waved and shouted at the German Hells Angels as they carried their dead on their shoulders. Before they could put Hitler in Landsberg prison, they had to catch him. And he was hiding at Putzi's house, and when the police showed up, Hitler had the arresting officers pin his medal on his coat before he was taken away, the Iron Cross First Class awarded to him during the Great War. Hitler had joined up with Ludwig III's brigade, and 90 days later they'd been loaded onto trains and sent to Ypres, where they were shelled for 4 days, and they were almost wiped out in this first Battle of Ypres that had stopped the Germans from reaching the sea. and then Hitler and his friends had started digging trenches. Hitler practiced painting pictures in the trenches, and when word got out about it, he was asked to paint the officers' club. And on the other side of the trenches from Hitler were the British. After Ypres, they marched south to fight at the Somme, where 500,000 men died, and Hitler was hit in the leg on the 7th of October in 1916 and won a promotion to corporal. And then he fought in the Third Battle of Ypres, and his regiment was also in the last German offensive in the spring of 1918. And when it was finally over, Hitler had been present at every major battle, and his unit had been called the Enlightenment Detachment. Hitler had resisted being promoted any higher than corporal because he would have lost his favorite position carrying messages on the motorcycle, and he also did not like to polish boots. But he did enjoy feeding the rats in the trenches, and sometimes he would spear them with his bayonet. But the war was not all fun for Hitler, because someone stole his dog, and then someone robbed his backpack and stole some of his paintings, and they probably ate his dog. In total, Hitler was awarded several medals, including the Iron Cross First Class on the 4th of August in 1918, and a German Jewish soldier had put it in for him. And Hitler was blinded by gas in October of 1918 and had recovered within 2 weeks, but went blind again on the 9th of November when he learned that Germany had surrendered. In the hospital, Hitler heard voices and saw a vision, and when he was discharged from the hospital, Hitler became a guard at a POW camp until it was closed down. After the beer hall putsch, Hitler was sentenced on the 1st of April in 1924 to 5 years in prison, and Hitler's jail cell was twice the size of his rented room, with bigger windows and a real view, and even the bed was a big improvement. All Hitler's friends were there, and they ate a formal dinner together every night, and during the day they gathered around a common table, and many of these privileges had been granted after Hitler had refused to eat for his first 2 weeks in Landsberg prison. Hitler was allowed visitors for 6 hours a day instead of the normal 6 hours a week, and he and his friends could receive all the packages they wanted, and they could exercise outside and take long walks around the yard. They ate very well and could buy a half-liter of wine or beer each day, and they would parade around the garden, singing stormtrooper songs, and they won over everybody working at the jail. The warden loaned Hitler a typewriter, and he started writing a book, and would read his daily writing out loud to his friends. And Hitler would later say that Mein Kampf was premature, that it was only, quote, fantasies behind bars, close quote. But it became very popular and earned him a decent amount of money in royalties. While Hitler was in jail, his followers kept up their political work by joining the Singing Club, the Pathfinder Detachment, and the Rifle and Hunting League, and at the next election without their leader, the Nazis only won half the number of congressional seats they had held before, and from this poor showing, the government thought it safe to release Hitler on parole. The fighting with communists was fizzling out, and the inflation was under control. And Ludendorff was having a hard time with his second marriage, and by the end of 1924, Germany was settling down, so Hitler was released from Landsberg in December, after being locked up a little over 1 year. But he was banned from speaking in public, and so he spoke in private instead. Hitler was 35 years old when he was released from prison, and no crowds were there to greet him. And the German Hells Angels were suffering because donations had dried up after the failure of the beer hall putsch. And money coming in from outside Germany was not stretching as far as it had under the inflation. The German Hells Angels had been officially banned, and the party newspaper had been shut down, and only a third of the members still belonged to the Nazi Party. Hitler had put on some weight when he was in jail, but it came off quickly enough because he had no money to buy food until he started going from house to house, getting wined and dined. His hosts began to donate to the party again, and book sales brought Hitler even more money. And in America, someone took Mein Kampf and cut it down to 1/4 of the text and added things not in Hitler's edition and put it on sale for 10 days in 1939. And Hitler sued in an American court, and the judge found in Hitler's favor, but only after 500,000 copies had been sold for a dime a copy. The party groups were still having meetings, and Hitler and those still loyal to the German Hells Angels would go to rival political meetings and start gang fights. And while Hitler wasn't allowed to speak in public, he would get up on the stage anyway, waving at the crowd and egging on the fighting. And the other groups would call the police and tell them that Hitler and his friends were not true members, that they were only pretending to belong. But the police would reply that it was not any business of the police and that everyone should just move along. Hitler bought a fancy car and hired a chauffeur, and he said that he was a writer and refused to pay taxes. And he said that the money donated to his political activities covered the expense of selling his book. Hitler wrote, "Nowhere do I possess property or other capital assets that I can call my own. I restrict of necessity my personal wants so far that I am a complete abstainer from alcohol and tobacco, take my meals in most modest restaurants, and aside from my minimal apartment rent, make no expenditures that are chargeable to my expenses as a political writer. Also, the automobile is for me but a means to an end. It alone makes it possible for me to accomplish my daily work." The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William L. Shirer, New York, Simon & Schuster, 1959-1960, page 13. With a footnote in the paperback edition referencing, quote, "the fascinating analysis of Hitler's income tax returns made by Professor Orrin James Hale in The American Historical Review, July 1955, close quote. The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich covered a period of 13 years and was 1,500 pages long. Hitler convinced them to reopen the newspaper and started carrying his leather whip everywhere again, and the newspaper announced the opening of the new and improved Nazi Party with an article called A New Beginning that made visionary and prophetic declarations about a war for Germany that would decide the fate of the whole planet. The Kaiser in exile wrote articles for Hitler's newspaper, and with every new edition, people were eager to attend the next meeting to see what exciting thing Hitler would say next. So many people came to that first meeting that the police threatened to close them down again, but only after allowing Hitler to speak for 2 hours amidst the heavy beer drinking, and the crowd shouted, "Hitler, we want Hitler," and from that meeting onward, Hitler was their only leader, and he began to wonder if he was the Messiah, and so did many others. Hitler would go to as many as 8 meetings a day, and was asked to speak as soon as he showed up. And he emphasized that the party should stick to their primary purpose, which was getting rid of Jew communists. And while the original platform had included both drunks and Jews, so many of the membership were heavy drinkers that they dropped the drunks part and just stuck to Jews. Hitler said that when enough members were elected within the government of every country, these would become the new leaders of the world. And Hitler said that the Nazis didn't need guns because they could accomplish their mission with their fists alone. Hitler didn't want Germany to take over the world, but for the world to become Nazis, just as the communists expected the world to join with them after the Russian Revolution. And Hitler expected America and other countries to get with the Nazi program on their own, and he believed people would be eager to become Nazis as soon as they heard the message clearly. When he read newspaper stories about labor strikes and class warfare in England, Hitler hoped to liberate the English with the wholesome Nazi way of life, and Hitler's reading of popular books taught him that willpower was greater than knowledge, because the English knights of King Arthur had tried to change might makes right, but had failed. So Hitler knew that the Round Table had been a waste of time, and now in Germany might would make right. Hitler considered this idea to be historically profound, as an old primal German wisdom born in Sparta and nourished in Rome. And Hitler invented a new salute that people thought was Roman, but Hitler claimed it was German, a gesture of greeting from the old days of German chivalry, when they came into court and raised an open palm to show no sword was held in the hand. After all, Hitler had been an altar boy, and he enjoyed processions and costumes and ceremonial enactments, and he knew the effect of solemn creeds and the power of blind faith, and most importantly, he had a taste for history and refused to allow the original party platform to be changed or updated because the old rusty version had depth and weight as an historical document, and for that reason the original held authority and strength. Hitler thought that the beer hall putsch proved that the state needed a police force loyal to ideals rather than to masters. So the SS was created on Armistice Day in 1925, 2 years from the day he had been arrested and charged with high treason. And the beer hall putsch became the Nazis' official birthday. The groups had been electing Hitler their chairman, but grew tired of having to continually re-elect him, so they voted him in as the permanent chairman, and Hitler became the conscience of all the groups.